Now, in Hong Kong, student leaders have reportedly agreed to hold talks with the government about the elections for a new leader in 2017. Well, many students were back in class today for the first time in more than a week, but kindergarten classes remain suspended. And while the numbers of protesters has dwindled, protesters are still clustered in several key areas of the city. Demonstrators say that they want to vote for a leader of their choice and not from a short list of candidates approved by Beijing. Well, Dibyesh Anand is a lecturer at the University of Westminster, and he's been watching the Occupy Central movement's rise and fall this month, and he joins us now. Dibyesh, are we seeing the end of the movement right now?
No, not at all. In fact, I would avoid using the word fall. Remember, this Occupy Central movement, as well as the student protests, they were slightly different but also had common aims, was meant to reform the process. So they never said that we want to overthrow the system or remove China from Hong Kong. The purpose was to encourage more democratization, and part of democratic protest always is to push for things, then compromise, then push for more things. So what we are finding is student leaders willing to negotiate with the chief executive of Hong Kong, but not giving up the demand right now.
We're also hearing that I mean, as you pointed out there, it's clearly not over. We actually hear that not only is it still bubbling over, there are more threats from the police.
There are more. In fact, this weekend at one time people said, oh, it's almost finished because the numbers had dwindled. And then the thugs, I mean, they were seen partly as members of Triad, but they were pro-Beijing protesters who came and tried to beat up the Occupy movement people. And suddenly you have hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers gathering. What we are finding is that numbers dwindle, people go on to do their daily life, but then they gather once they realize that police is going to crack down on protesters. So there's a lot of support for protests, and therefore I think what we'd have to do is watch out for what the student leaders and other leaders talk with the chief executive officer.
Indeed. I mean, so they've agreed to hold formal talks with the government. Are they going to be given what they want? Because they say they don't want to change their demands.
They don't want to change their demand, but remember, that's part of any negotiation. They'll say they don't want to change any demand, and of course, Beijing has made it clear that it's not going to do anything. But the history of Hong Kong as well as China shows that it's unlikely that China will give up. Because for China, the main threat is not democracy in Hong Kong, but the main threat is the example that can set for Chinese people in mainland China. And therefore, for instance, if they give in to demands of the people, then the idea that it may inspire people in Beijing or Shanghai to also make similar demands in the future.
How much complexity does the protest add to an already complicated city-state that straddles both China and the West?
I mean, in a sense, I mean, a lot of times, especially the Beijing apologists for Beijing would say, oh, it's largely Britain. In fact, they would always blame Britain for some reason, that imperialists are stirring up trouble against Beijing. The fact is, most rich people, most billionaires in Hong Kong are pro-Beijing because they make money through Beijing. So what we are finding is largely the middle classes and the lower middle classes who are either very strongly pro-democrat or those who believe that they are losing out because of closer integration with Beijing, and they are the ones who are making these demands. I think the most inspiring part of this is that, one, it has been largely peaceful, despite police attempt to push and in fact use violence, and second is, despite knowing that they may not get what they want, they are coming out to protest. That itself is inspiring because it reminds Beijing and to Hong Kong people and to the wider world that people in Hong Kong are not simply sheep who can be led away by Beijing to slaughterhouse.
What about suggestions that actually Hong Kong is just there, but actually it's part of a wider struggle that is going on in Beijing between the current leadership and possibly the previous leadership, and wanting to sort of draw the present leadership into another Tiananmen-style?
Now, remember, one thing is with Chinese politics, we never know exactly what happens, and no one seems to know, except maybe even the Chinese president himself doesn't know what's happening in the system. It's so authoritarian and closed system. But that could be possible. There's a leadership struggle, but that doesn't come out so openly. It's more likely that Hong Kong protests can be seen as part of a wider trend in China also, where there are large-scale protests like Tibetans or Uyghurs, but also by Han Chinese themselves. So Han Chinese would be ethnic Chinese who protest a lot on economic issues, not so much political issues. So what it could be seen is, and approximately even Chinese government figures is 60 to 80,000 protests taking place in China every year. But what the government has been successful at is preventing these protesters from coming together with each other, so keeping protests localized. And that is what the aim is in Hong Kong, to keep the protests in Hong Kong localized and prevent any kind of solidarity movement in Beijing or Shanghai.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for joining us.